Good evening. Anna Ohanian, Richard B. Finnegan Distinguished Professor of Political Science and International Relations, will sit down with the first analytical tonight. Dr. Ohanian, thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you for the invite.
You just spoke at a conference on comprehensive security and resilience. Security is still a primary concern for all layers in Armenia, the society, the experts, the political field. What is the correct formula for building a security system for Armenia in your estimation?
That's a great question, and a quick clarification that I spoke at the EVN Media Festival conference and a panel on national security, but I did attend the conference on the resilience. But on the question of building Armenia's security, that's a very important question. It's a timely question. And I have been looking and researching that for the past over 10 years or so. So I have several books on the subject and articles. What I would like to say that is no single formula. It's a process. It now requires, considering that the whole world is moving and shifting in terms of the end of the bipolar world order, the rise of regions, you could say, which creates opportunities and dangers for small states like Armenia. So there are some general trends that affect Armenia as a small state, but there are also specific conditions unique to Armenia that also create opportunities and risks. Overall, looking comparatively, comparing Armenia to other regions, to other countries with similar challenges, as well as historically, Armenia's security it's multi-layered. On the one hand, the strengthening of the Armenian state, its democratic institution will help to increase the security of the individuals, so the human security, whether it's women, whether marginalized groups and individuals, but also in general, nascent democracies, new democracies like Armenia, and there's higher level of protest activity overall, simply because these are open societies, but the institutions are still weak. And at this conference that you mentioned, there's a lot of talk on increasing resilience. Resilience, mobilizing society, connections between the private sector, civil society, and the government. These are all challenges for all states. For Armenia, that's doubly important, simply because if Armenia is not united, for example, around specific norms and values, then if there are divisions, polarization will create risks of hybrid warfare. It will weaken the state. Growing polarization will affect the quality of democratic institutions, and will offer openings for hybrid attacks from external actors. And this is something that many countries deal with. But at the same time, externally, the enhancement of Armenia's external security obviously is very much linked to our ability of the Armenian state to diversify its relations with numerous actors in the Eurasian continent, as well as countries with Africa, countries in Latin America. This is a small state strategy that requires this level of diversification. But that's one layer. The additional layer that I prioritize heavily is the regional level of analysis. Armenia needs to continue to build structures of regional governance in the South Caucasus. That means elevating diplomacy with Georgia. I make this point every time I give talks. Building, even when engaging with Azerbaijan, the peace agreement, for example, I would be curious as to whether our diplomats are looking at the possibility of embedding that peace agreement into building regional structures of governance. Basically, the more diplomatic front lines for Armenia, the better. So it's a multi-layered process, internally, regionally, and internationally.
Most experts that I speak to do not believe that a peace treaty will be signed, but they also advise the Armenian government to stay in the peace process. Explain this to me, please. Why is it necessary to stay in the peace process if you do not believe that your peace will be guaranteed by a treaty that is to be signed?
That's a very good question. So I think Armenia's challenge is that it is dealing with not only just an authoritarian state, but meaning Azerbaijan, but it's a personalized authoritarian state, and it's a declining petro state. So these two things make Azerbaijan, which heavily militarized. Internally, Azerbaijan institutions are very weak. It does not have much of strong institutions to speak of because everything has been personalized. And its oil resources are rapidly declining and gas is not a substitute. So Azerbaijan is due for a shift in its social contract with its people. Right now, so far, the model has been you keep your mouth shut. I will cover the basics, and that led to an inability of the Azerbaijani state to provide the basic public goods. The level of inequality is very high in Azerbaijan. So there are a lot of stressors inside Azerbaijan that are not visible, that are suppressed, and that's why force is used. But that is also a risk. Now, in terms of why should you consider negotiating with this type of a player, I just published an article in an American periodical called The National Interest, where I argue that the Western support of a peace before security approach, which essentially that's what the Western powers seem to be doing, or at least supporting, is problematic. I've advocated for security before peace, meaning that Armenia, and there's a lot of scholarship on peace studies as well. There's scholarship, quantitative studies that measure the effectiveness of peace agreements, for instance. So I advocate that it's important to establish security before peace, meaning the priority for Armenia, and this is why this peace process is important, that while Azerbaijan might not be negotiating fully towards a comprehensive peace agreement, but by this is what, the 9th draft of the peace agreement being negotiated, numerous meetings that I lost count already. In that process, while there is so much diplomacy, so little peace, you would argue, but at the same time, this process has helped to constrain Azerbaijan, has helped to socialize Azerbaijan into the international norms. Every time, whether it's the Prague summit, whether it's the Almaty summit, the norms against territorial conquest, against aggression are reinforced. And I think in Armenia, understanding the strategic value of international norms, not just military deterrence, these are all important. But I think Armenia as a small state needs to learn and develop the habits and the practice of working through realizing the value, the strategic value of international norms. So this peace process, while it did not produce a peace agreement so far, and it might produce an agreement, which may, and then you need to talk about how good of an agreement that is, what it does and does not do. But even this process is important because it helped to constrain Azerbaijan, to bring it, to keep it tied to the negotiation table. And it has Armenia-Azerbaijan peace process is also important for the South Caucasus. It's also good for Georgia because it is reinforcing the norms against conquest, which is also a priority for Georgia as well.
Dr. Ohanyan, are you saying that the only thing that we are gaining by protracting the process, the peace process, by engaging in it, is that we are winning time?
On the one hand, yes. Because Armenia does need time to build its military deterrence capacities. If you're stronger militarily, I'm not advocating that Armenia needs to then attack Azerbaijan. That is not what I'm saying. But if you're stronger militarily, diplomacy also becomes easier. Armenia as a small state, military is not a solution. I don't think that's the first thing. That should be the instrument of last resort. But the peace process is important to also keep Azerbaijan by time, because Azerbaijan is a declining state and we don't know how that is going to be managed, whether you're going to see Arab Spring style high-level protests that are going to combust because there is no civil society to absorb the shock, or whether we're going to see a palace coup inside Azerbaijan. There are a variety of scenarios. But it's just that, simply to say that Aliyev is using the peace process for regime stability. It is using the greenwashing its regime, its ethnic cleansing that it carried out, using COP29 to legitimize its power. So Azerbaijan does use the language of liberal norms, peace, climate change, green politics, right? But at the same time, there are very deep structural issues inside Azerbaijani state, and that's a problem for Armenia as well as Georgia.
However, Azerbaijan matters a lot to the West as well, and they often say so in these very words. Would you say that a democratic Armenia, or an Armenia that is on the path of transition to democracy, is more important than geopolitical interests for the West?
I think Armenia's democracy is necessary for Armenian state, period. Armenia, sometimes I would get this question, how come Armenia democratized and yet we're not seeing a dramatic shift within the Euro-Atlantic structure? United States has a long track record of having relationships with various types of authoritarian states. So it is naive to assume that just because you're a democratic country, West Euro-Atlantic system is going to switch. It's just not the practice. However, there's growing advocacy for the need for Europe and United States to coordinate more closely between democratic societies, because if you do not support democratic societies, it is going to cost you in strategic interest. And authoritarian countries are coordinating. But I think there's a second part to your question that I'm not answering. That's right. So as to why is Azerbaijan important to Europe, I think in terms of the gas, it's heavily exaggerated. Very often, European, in the midst of the Russian invasion in Ukraine, Ursula von der Leyen's statement, reliable partner, etc., Azerbaijan is going to double. Azerbaijan's domestic needs for oil and gas are increasing. So if for Azerbaijan to be able to double its supplies to Europe, it has to get it from Russia. So it will be, again, laundering the Russian gas for Europe. But even with that, Azerbaijan provides less than 3% of European needs, energy needs. Moreover, Russian invasion in Ukraine accelerated the search for alternatives to Russian gas. So European countries are moving very, very fast away from gas. So I think in that respect, that really is taking. I think Azerbaijani primary interest is very much has to do, I would argue, in terms of its relationship with Israel. I think that's the crux of the issue than anything else.
You painted quite an exhaustive picture of Azerbaijan, of their societal structure, as well as the vertical structure, authority, and the people. Could you give a similar picture of Armenia?
So Armenia is dramatically different. Armenia, within the literature of comparative politics, Azerbaijan is considered fully consolidated, personalized, militarized authoritarian state, personalized autocracy, while Armenia is a nascent democracy. So far, obviously, Armenia's challenges of democratization are there, but I think I would argue that primary challenge of Armenia's democratization is the strengthening of its institutions of governance. It's a free society, civil society is very strong, but for these democratic openings to consolidate, the state needs to be able to be an effective problem solver.
And this is exactly what we lack.
Well, young states, young democracies, it's typical, unfortunately. It's just Armenia does not have the luxury of time. In general, if you look quantitatively worldwide, part of the reason as to why you see democratic declines is that democratic societies have not been able in solving problems. Statehood problem is the question. So there's this, whether it's connected to social media, polarization is high, which is attacking the governance capacities. But even established democracies struggle with this. There are countries in Africa that experience transitions back to militarization, and the researchers link it to the inability of the democratic states to solve problems. So Armenia does not have a choice. For Armenia to survive and to prosper and to flourish as a democratic state, as a state in general, it needs to strengthen its democracy and its statehood, institutions of governance, all the way from the local levels of governance all the way to the state level. And today at this conference, there was a lot of talk about building resiliency between various sectors. And for that to happen, the democracy is the engine that helps to build the state. And this is not a new process for Armenia. I think if you look historically, in the pre-Soviet period, even when Armenia was part of the Russian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, Armenian communities were, and I don't want to digress too much from your question, But Armenian society was always self-organized. It always had political parties, civil society. So this is not new to Armenia. This is not a Western export. This is how Armenia has survived over millennia. So I do remain optimistic, but at the same time, the reforms are simply crucial. The statehood problem, the statehood as building the state institutions of governance, if they are not done, people can move away from democracy. We see this happening in other parts of the world.
It is obvious that the Armenian authorities are trying to resolve the conflict in the region, or at least make hostility with Turkey and Azerbaijan manageable. Do you believe that this is a possible task to accomplish?
I do agree that it is a very important path to establish diplomatic relations with Turkey and move towards and try as much as you can, at least maintain a peace process with Azerbaijan while deepening relations with Georgia. Unless, and this is a really tectonic shift in the region, unless the relationship with Turkey, Azerbaijan and Georgia are not developed and transformed, dependence on Russia will remain. And right now, Russia's approach to world politics, not just Armenia, is revisionist. Meaning Russia started this whole invasion in Ukraine largely to look for a new security arrangement with Europe, which it did not get. So by attacking, by invading another state, which is a war of conquest, it's illegitimate, it's illegal, Russia essentially has exercised a pivot. People talk about whether Armenia is pivoting or not. The only country that is pivoting in this region, that's Russia. And Russia is pivoting away from the Western. Russia was heavily embedded in the Euro-Atlantic structures. It was able to maintain its new imperial system within the liberal rules-based world order. It sounds ironic, but that's how I see it. Now that Russia is under heavy sanctions regime, there's oil and gas embargo, Russia is already obviously moved towards China, and in that process it is trying to attack the established systems of global governance, and every small state that is in that process will pay the cost. So which is why it's important for Armenia to stick to the international norms, to build its sovereignty, and essentially here Russia's and Armenia's interests clash. That does not mean Armenia needs to abandon Russia, but Armenia does need to manage Russia's new imperial rise as well as decline. So both processes are happening.
For quite a long time, Aliyev did not want to hear anything of demarcation, and suddenly it's in process. Why do you believe they stepped on the track of a constructive dialogue?
Honestly, when I heard the news of the agreement to demarcate the Tavush region, I was really surprised, because you're right, it is not in Aliyev's interest to engage in border delimitation. Border delimitation is the most important norm, border stability, that distinguishes liberal rules-based norms, world order based on transparency, border stability versus new imperial logic that Russia advances, which does not recognize borders, it does not recognize transparency. And Russia is actually now pushing against the borders, I believe, in Scandinavia. I think there are issues with Lithuania, maritime borders. So Russia is already over there in the Baltics, is pressing against border stability of NATO countries. So in this respect, I do not know what brought Aliyev to the table. COP29, international image, Aliyev is dying to get legitimacy. That could be one factor. But also, I believe the Western pressure has been strong on Aliyev in order to engage in this process. The question is, what Armenia can get before COP29. I would argue that trying to delimit the border, as much of it as possible before COP29, is very important for Armenia, much more important than a signed peace agreement, I would say. Because peace process is a much longer process, that's a decade-long process. And right now, keep in mind, Aliyev, Armenian society in these peace negotiations, through its elected government, is speaking to one person, Aliyev. So you have Armenian society speaking to one person on the peace agreement. Why is this important to think about? Because there are numerous voices inside Azerbaijan who are stakeholders for peace. There's studies that have been done, obviously, with the, you have to take with a grain of salt as to what people say in the surveys, but at some point I saw a number that 75% of Azerbaijani respondents in that survey argued that they do want peace agreement with Armenia. So Aliyev, by keeping the society, not allowing it, because it's a petrostate, it's not allowing the stakeholders for peace to develop. Business people, civil society actors, tourism, you name it. And he's the only one who speaks for Azerbaijan. But trust me, he's not representing Azerbaijani society. So peace is a much longer process. Right now, Armenia needs to manage the rivalry, severe rivalry with Azerbaijan, to bring it to manage rivalry to cold peace.
Do you not underestimate the hostility that has been injected in the Azerbaijani society through decades against Armenians when you say that Azerbaijani society does want peace? Or shall we limit your statement to the civil society?
I understand what I agree with you, but at the same time, I think by wanting peace within Azerbaijani society, that does not mean that they want reconciliation, the immediate reconciliation. They do not want war. The socioeconomic issues, poverty, inequality is significant inside Azerbaijan. While there was a lot of support for the war in Nagorno-Karabakh, recover, quote-unquote, Nagorno-Karabakh, so Azerbaijan was able to bulldoze through a peace process, right? But Azerbaijan does not have the same support for an interstate war. Because it's an authoritarian society, you do not see, there are mothers who died, who lost soldiers there as well. So there's a lot of trauma there as well. And you don't see the struggles, societal struggles for it. War is war, war is trauma. Even with high levels of Armenophobia, absolutely, that does not mean that Azerbaijani people would want another war, which will be much more different, because the international community will not sit quiet this time around, because this will be against international norms. It will be costly for even states who buy, the few states who buy energy resources from Azerbaijan. So, and every single, by the way, authoritarian state, it's much more expensive to suppress your society by force. The alternative being you just develop an enemy, right? And you fuel narrow xenophobic nationalism, right? You have an out-group. So Armenophobia is a much cheaper way for Aliyev to keep its society quiet. Yeah.
As to stay in power.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're most welcome.
Anna Ohanyan, Richard B. Finnegan, Distinguished Professor of Political Science and International Relations, sat down with the First Analytical tonight.